Okay, here we are. So the broadcast is live now, and Tom, we're really pleased and happy that you're taking time off to participate in this. So that's brilliant of you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Let me just introduce you to the course and course participants here. We're in Denmark, the Danish School of Journalism, and this is a sort of a mid and further career diploma course in professional use of social media. And we have a few other satellites joining us online here, but otherwise. Please meet the participants here, and I won't give you a personal presentation, but just to give you an impression of who's actually taking part here. We have we have Niels from one of the largest Danish trade unions. Niels is from the communications department, and Nikki from a regional Danish daily web editor, and Mette, who is from a women's magazine, widely very popular here in Denmark. And you have Mia from a large Danish bank communication department, and Lotte, who is a freelance communication professional. Claus, who's a journalist at one of the largest Danish dailies, and Mette, who's a colleague of mine from the Danish School of Journalism, and Rune from a large Danish daily tabloid. Rasmus from a large Danish daily Politiken, and Lone from a regional Danish daily. So media professionals joining up here in a course headlined Professional Use of Social Media. So that should sort of give you an idea of what this is about here. Yeah. And so, we've read your book. It's part of the course curriculum, and we do have questions about that. But we'd really like to ask you first if you would like to share with us. Tell us about your own social media habits, and maybe also share with us some favorite social media moments.
I suppose I take the approach that when a new social network comes along, I tend to sort of sign up for it quite quickly and see if there's anything there. So I tend to join everything, and then very few of them are sort of intriguing enough that I end up continuing to use them. So quite predictably, I mostly use Twitter. I use Facebook a certain amount as well, but I do try to maintain the convention that Facebook is for people I actually know. So I mostly communicate with my friends and family on there, and whereas Twitter is something that I communicate with my peers, if you like. Other journalists, other people interested in the history of media, other people in technology, other drummers. So that's a much wider group, and I really like the difference between those two worlds. I'm just trying to think which other networks I use. I like Instagram. I've used that for a long time. Inevitably, you kind of can't get away from LinkedIn. And then there are some sort of interesting new things that are floating around. I liked Path. Path has a very, it's been around for a while, and goodness knows what will happen to it. But it has some user interface innovations. Google Plus, I seem to have managed to join 3 times. It's so great that I joined it 3 times. It's because I keep having to create new accounts, because when we shuffle the way the email system works at work, I need to create another one. So there's that one as well. There's a very nice new app I've been using called Stella, which is a bit like Instagram for picture stories. So instead of presenting a single image, it allows you to create several images in a flipbook. And my wife is a doctor, but she's also a very keen photographer. So she's particularly keen on these social networks that are around photography. So Flickr was the big one, and Flickr sort of became very large, and a lot of people migrated from that to Instagram. And now Instagram has become very large. They're sort of looking for somewhere else to go. Some of them have gone to Google Plus, but there are other sort of photography-related social networks. Some of us are quite specialist out there as well. So I like to sort of keep an eye on all of these things. Vine, I've fooled around with, but it's not really something I can be bothered with. So essentially, I suppose I advocate promiscuity. Join all of them, try all of them. Oh yes, Tumblr as well. I quite like Tumblr, mainly because my daughter loves it. She's a teenager, and she just loves doing things on Tumblr. And it's very interesting to see the difference in, when I use Tumblr, I'm sort of looking for all the features you would expect on a blogging platform, and I try to use it like a blogging platform. And she, she sort of is exasperated that I'm such an old person that I expect Tumblr to work like WordPress or some system from 5 years ago, when Tumblr is very, very different. So that's an interesting perspective as well, to see how she does things. She likes Minecraft as a social environment, and so that's another one as well. So basically, I'm up for everything, and I think that's quite useful as well from a professional point of view. I think if you have to deal with technology at work and you're expected to keep up with it, whether that's social media or other kinds of technology, my advice is always, just try everything. So I whatever new piece of technology has come along, I'm up for giving it a try, and you can quickly determine whether it makes sense for you, and therefore whether it's likely to make sense for other people.
Great, great. Do you perhaps have some favorite moments you can think of?
I suppose I'm a drummer, and my hero as a drummer is Stuart Copeland of the Police, who is one of the greatest rock drummers ever, because he has such a distinctive style. And he tweeted me once, which I was very thrilled by. So I'm a total fanboy when it comes to that sort of thing. So I just love the fact that allows people to, I get people sending me random messages as well, and I love the way that it sort of gives you a license to sidle up to people and say things to them, and they don't have to respond, but sometimes they do. And in that sense, it's, as I make the point in my book, it's rather like a coffee house, because the rule in the coffee house was that you had to be polite to people, and I mean, obviously not everyone is polite on Twitter, but the idea was that the house rules actually didn't just tolerate but encouraged strangers to speak to each other, and that's one of the things that's so exciting about Twitter, that you can find yourself talking to people who you would never get to encounter in real life.
Great. Could you maybe share a bit with us what turning focus onto your working environment?
Yeah.
Probably not all of your colleagues have read your book, and probably not all of your colleagues are as promiscuous in social media as you. But can you describe, maybe, is there a sort of a general journalistic use of social media at The Economist?
There is, and I think it's not as joined up as it could be. So we've just had a new social media editor start here. We had the previous person started doing more and more journalism, and so we gave him a journalist job, and then we hired a new social media editor. So we had a few months where we weren't really paying as close attention to this as we could have been, I suspect. We punch above our weight on social media, yet we don't do an awful lot of the things that you are supposed to do. So The Economist does well on metrics like median clicks per tweet. So we seem to engage very closely, engage our readers. I think this is because of the nature of the content that we produce. So The Economist tends to take an analytical approach to every subject it writes about, no matter what it is. So if you're the kind of person that likes that way of looking at the world, there's a pretty good chance that you'll like quite a lot of what we write about. Whereas if you follow a newspaper like the New York Times or the Guardian on Twitter, the chances are that you'll only be interested in some of the things they tweet. I'm not interested in sport or fashion, and I'm not interested in New York news from the metro area of New York, etc., etc. So the chances of me being interested in an average tweet from those large news organizations are much lower than an Economist reader being interested in an average tweet from us. And so I think this is why we get these much higher engagement numbers when you look at it in that way. But we do an awful lot of things that you really aren't supposed to. I mean, you're not supposed to have this sort of voice of God editorial tone, apparently. I mean, this is what people say. I think that's wrong. I don't think there is a sort of correct Twitter tone of voice or correct Facebook tone of voice. I think it's all about being authentic and being on Twitter the way you are, both as a human and as a company, the way you really are. So I think as long as the voice of The Economist on Twitter is the same as the voice of The Economist in The Economist, then people recognize that does. It's the problem you get, I think, is when a fusty company tries to be cool on Twitter, then then everyone can tell that it's just, or when a CEO of a company tries to be cool, it's just embarrassing, and it's because it's not authentic. And so I think authenticity is the right approach, and it sort of connects to the debate in journalism about transparency and objectivity. I think being transparent and being authentic are the key. So if you like what we do in print, you'll probably like what we do on Twitter. Then we also have, so those are the sort of formal accounts that we have. And then the journalists, many of the journalists use Twitter quite a lot. And what we haven't really done before, but we're starting to do now, is connect the corporate official accounts with the journalist accounts. So we're starting to retweet the journalists when they say something funny, and we're starting to mention them in the main feed and things like that. And the idea there is both to remind the readers that the Economist is produced by real humans, and in fact our readers always tend to like this when we pull the curtain aside slightly and reveal some of the inner workings, because we are more secretive, I suppose, than most news organizations because of the tradition of anonymity. And it's not a deliberate desire to be secretive, it's just a tradition that we've maintained. Anyway, so we are starting to point out who the humans on Twitter are who actually write The Economist. And this also encourages the journalists themselves to get more involved on Twitter, because it's possible that our giant Twitter following will become aware of them and will follow them and so on. So this is a good two-way street. We can amplify the message of The Economist on Twitter by using the personal journalist accounts and the official corporate accounts together. So we're going to be doing more of that. So those are the sorts of things we're doing. But I'm very aware of the fact that we are not doing social media, we're not following best practice in many ways. In some ways that's deliberate, and in other ways it's because we haven't got there yet, but we are changing things.
It's very interesting. It's an ongoing theme in this course, and it's something that both the colleagues here and many journalists in Denmark and communicators are struggling with, this balance between having to be to some degree personal and interesting, and then sort of balancing that with traditional journalistic objectivity. And that must be also a subject that you and your colleagues are discussing.
Yes and no, but I think our take on the objectivity question, this is something that newspapers get particularly, and American news organizations get particularly worked up about, the idea that everything should be perfectly objective, and you should say, and that, but in practice what that means is, some people think climate change is real and some people don't, and we've never really done that. The Economist has always taken positions on things, and the difference between doing that and being, a biased source or whatever, I mean, we admit what our biases are is the crucial thing. So we were founded originally to campaign in favor of free trade. So on trade matters, it's very clear what we'll say, and we'll usually say something like, as a newspaper founded to campaign for free trade, The Economist thinks that X. So I think it's fine to have these to take these positions as long as you're very open about what they are. What irritates me about Fox News, say, is that it pretends to be unbiased but is very clearly biased. I don't have a problem with them being biased, I just have a problem with them not being open about what the bias is. So this is what is sometimes called transparency as the new objectivity, and it says as long as you say what your biases are, and this actually started in the technology press. People started saying a few years ago, well, if somebody's reviewing a piece of software and they usually use this system and it's running on that system, shouldn't they tell us? Because otherwise, should I tell you I'm a Mac user, view a new Windows phone? It's that sort of thing, and very often you get these things starting in technology blogs first, I find, because they are the most radical and the most technologically advanced. They're the most technologically radical part of the media, because they are by definition the most technologically savvy. And so you get, this is why Ezra Klein has gone to Vox. Vox has built this fantastic content management system called Chorus, and you tend to get these new models appearing weirdly in tech blogging first. And this is one of them. So the idea of saying very, very carefully what all your biases are, I think, is a good. I think that's how we deal with it. We don't really have a problem. People expect The Economist to take these positions, and as long as we're open about what they are, I think that's fine. And I think more news organizations should do the same. I think instead of pretending that they are totally impartial, I think they should say, no, we think this and we think that, and if you don't like it, fair enough, but at least we've told you what our biases are.
What about the other balancing act, stepping out from behind a byline, or in your case, even stepping out from behind a newspaper? That's
Yeah.
also a balancing act. How do you and your colleagues cope with that?
Well, to be honest, I think Twitter is a good thing. So our anonymity policy is spraying around the edges because of digital media. So we do, name our journalists when they appear in our videos, for example, and similarly, we allow them to tweet. In fact, we encourage them to tweet under their own names. But I think this is a good thing for us because. Essentially, the anonymity is part of our brand, and I don't think we'll ever change it. But it can be slightly difficult to lure people to The Economist who are used to having a byline somewhere else. So in some cases, that can be a problem. And if you say to them, well, look, you're still allowed to go on radio and TV, you can still write books, and you can still, and this is a big deal, you can tweet under your own name. They're much more happy about that because they really can have their own following and they really can take it from one publication to another. And Twitter really makes that explicit. So I think that's actually helped us to recruit and retain people because it is a very convenient. It means that the anonymity of our articles doesn't change on the page or on the screen. But as far as the journalist is concerned, one of the big drawbacks of that anonymity is actually to a large extent neutralized by Twitter.
Yeah. Maybe I should convey to you that in Denmark we are sort of, generally speaking, at a different place than you are in Britain in terms of wide use of social media in the press. It's not that it's not used, it is, but we're sort of a few years behind. So this whole thing of sort of stepping out from your byline and also actually showing yourself is still maybe on a different level than where in Britain. It's still sort of a personal. It's felt personally as a sort of a strange thing to have to do.
Well, maybe it reflects the fact that we have a rather different attitude to journalism in Britain. I get the impression from what you're saying that you have a more professionalized group of journalists, so it's closer to America. And I think in Britain, we've never seen journalism as a profession. Very few journalists in Britain have any qualification in it. And in fact, in my experience, having any qualification in it makes it harder to get a job in journalism because it's expected. No one really takes it that seriously as a profession. It's a craft. You learn to do it on the job, and people don't have terribly high expectations of their journalists, and so I don't think it sort of shatters any illusion of professional conduct if journalists also go on Twitter and behave pretty much the way they do. This is certainly the case for columnists and so on. They are actually able to extend their personal brands beyond their weekly column or whatever it is by using social media.
Yeah, you're resonating beautifully with the crowd here, so that's great. Okay, can we maybe I'll shift the subject a bit. One of the questions from the team here: what systems and routines do you have in place at the Economist when it comes to validating content from social media?
Well, to be honest, we're weekly, so we aren't using, breaking news. I mean, social media is great because it's the place where news appears first. But that's not really hugely valuable to us because mostly what we're producing is stuff on a weekly cycle. And even the pieces we produce on a day-to-day basis aren't breaking news. We're not trying to compete with the BBC and other people and other newspapers to break news. What we really are known for is adding analysis and context to up-to-the-minute information from social media, and then the perils that come with that. It's not really a field that we've had to venture into. So we will, we'll say, when a world leader tweets something of interest, we'll quote these things, but we are not unlike, say, the BBC, and I've had very interesting conversations with them about how they validate, video footage from Syria. How can you tell which city it's in, what time of year it is? And they have these amazing experts, forensic experts, who can say, well, the license plates here show you that this is actually, a different country, or the dialect of Arabic that's being spoken tell you that this is a different part of the country from what's being claimed. And I find all that terribly interesting, but it's not something we have to grapple with at The Economist.
I see. At The Economist, you told us a bit about your social media strategy and the way you're sort of moving into it. Are you seeing sort of new uses on the horizon? Are you positioning for new uses of social media, or?
Well, I think the main thing for us is that The Economist has a um, sort of has a problem. It has a very respected brand among those people who know it, but a lot of people assume that all we do is write about economics. And actually, of the sort of 66 pages of editorial in each week's issue, only 6 pages are about finance and economics. So we actually cover mostly, we cover politics, we cover business, we cover science, technology, culture, etc. And we have this problem, therefore, that there are a lot of people out there who really ought to be economist readers. There are sorts of people, they are globally minded, they're intellectually curious, but they assume that The Economist is not for them, because it's only about economics. So how do we convince them otherwise? And in fact, the single best tool we have for that is social media, because we can put content out on social media that they can encounter, and they can, for example, we do a daily chart every day, which takes a very economisty, it's a sort of encapsulation of the values of The Economist. So it's global, it's analytical, it's driven by data, it's quite often quite quirky. So sometimes it's about very serious subjects like the death penalty, and other times it's about silly subjects. So we had a famous chart where we did a map of how much alcohol is consumed in different parts of the world. And there was a huge debate in Scandinavia in particular, because I think it was the Swedes were expecting to be, to be as heavy drinkers as the Norwegians and the Finns and the Russians, and for some reason they weren't. And so the question was, why was this? And then we had another very popular chart that was about plastic surgery. What sorts of plastic surgery do different countries have? What is the most popular sort of plastic surgery, and which country has the most? And these sorts of charts do extremely well on social media, but they act as a very good ambassador for us, because most of the people who come and look at a chart like that on the Economist website will be new to The Economist. They will not be existing readers, and so our existing readers who follow us, or fans who follow us, who may not necessarily be subscribers, will be sharing this and spreading it. And this is a fantastic way for us to reach new people and to say to them, look, there's interesting stuff here that you might want to read. So that's really the motivation behind our social media strategy, which is that we think it's the single best way to reach the people who aren't reading The Economist but that we think should be.
Interesting. And most people probably are not aware that you also have some of the funniest and quirkiest image captions in the business.
Yes, we sort of, again, that's a historical accident. I have to say, when I arrived 15 years ago, I was expecting to be, taken aside and trained in how to write these sarcastic captions. But actually, once you're in the building, it just sort of comes naturally. Historically, it's because we don't commission very much photography. We do commission some, but mostly we use pictures from newswires. And so, they may be pictures that you've seen before, or so we need to in some way make them our own. And the way we do that is through the captions, which are essentially sort of British schoolboy humour.
Yeah, they're hilarious. So, Tom, which social media platform, in your mind, has the most staying power? Can you say anything about that at all?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, it is. I think there is sort of a growing awareness of the danger for companies in general, but for individuals as well. But if you invest a lot of time and resources to build a large following on a platform, you are actually at the mercy of the company that controls that platform. So we have something like 5 million followers on Twitter and 2 or 3 million on Facebook, which is great. But if we do something wrong, or there's a mistake, or I don't know, they could take that away from us. And that's kind of worrying, that there's this concentration in these vertical silos, and it is, I think, an anomaly in the history of the internet, and certainly an anomaly in the history of social media more broadly, as I write about it in my book. If you look, I mean, we like to think of Facebook and Twitter as market squares where people can say what they like, but they're much more like privately owned malls, shopping malls, and if you offend the management, they can turf you out. And so I love both of those platforms, and I like using them, but I do look at them and think, is this like the situation in the 1990s when access to the internet for consumers was dominated by CompuServe and AOL? And at the time they looked impregnable, but in fact they were in a few years swept aside by the open standards of the web. And so I'm wondering whether that will be the fate of social media. And there's this new movement called the indie web movement. And indie web is all about what's called the re-decentralization of the web. So the web was, the web is a decentralized publishing platform. Anyone can set up a web server, plug it in, and it will work. And similarly, email, anyone can make their own web server, their own mail server if they want to, and plug it into the internet, and the protocols will allow all of that to work. That's not the case with social media. There aren't open standards for it. We had Usenet in the 1990s, and it was a sort of social platform on the web based on standards, but it was very slow and very sort of, you couldn't hold conversations on it. Now, part of the problem from a computer science point of view is that if you're going to use these social platforms for sort of conversational interaction, then you need to guarantee fast and in-order delivery of status updates. So Twitter wouldn't work if some of the tweets took 10 minutes to get onto the timeline and some of them took 10 seconds. It's got to show you the stuff in the order in which it happens, otherwise you can't follow it. And so that's very difficult to do with a distributed computing platform, which is why a centralized platform has won in that space. So what could happen is this computer science problem could be solved, and people could figure out how to do a distributed version of that. That's a possibility. There are lots of people working on that. Another possibility is that the style of social media interaction could move on. It could move on from this reverse chronological feed, which is the dominant mode of using it at the moment. And already we see, Facebook is interfering with the chronological ordering of the stream. It's putting important stories at the top, which aren't necessarily the most recent. So either of those things could disrupt the dominance of those current platforms. I think the other thing to watch out for is that there could be a backlash against the sort of surveillance aspect of this. So if you can imagine that a new social platform is created, an open source, open standards based one, and a few geeks use it, but most people don't want to. But then there's a catastrophic privacy breach at one of the big platforms, and then everyone writes articles about how you can switch to these other open platforms that are more secure and where you own your data, and you're not sort of paying for the use of the platform by giving up your personal data. So I think that's quite a plausible scenario in the next decade, and that's really the thing I'm looking for. But that doesn't affect how we use social platforms on a day-to-day basis right now.
So actually, maybe also with your special historical overview, you actually do think that disruption is still a possibility against these behemoths.
Oh yes, I mean we've seen this. The history of the internet. Google has stayed on top for a very long time, but nobody's stayed on top forever, as it were. And so I think it's very hard to see how Facebook and Twitter, they look impregnable now, but who knows what will come along in the next 5 years. And we see the interest in new messaging apps, and in particular these ephemeral messaging systems, which allow you to where leave no traces. That seems to be quite a big trend, and Twitter and Facebook are on the wrong side of that trend. So if that turns out to be what the next generation of users wants, they've got a big problem.
Right. Moving to your book, Social Media, the First 2,000 Years, Writing on the Wall. I don't know whether this question is one of the guys not having to read your book, but what are your most important takeaways from social media?
Yes, I think the single most important one is just to say, look, this isn't a fad. This isn't a thing that's going to go away. And I still see some companies sort of putting their hands over their ears and saying, oh no, we really don't want to get involved in this. Surely it'll just go away, or surely we can just ask outsource the handling of this. And we saw this with the internet actually in the 1990s. It's a very similar situation where companies thought that first they could ignore it, and then when they realized they couldn't, they said, well, can we get someone to do it for us? And then they said, all right, can we have an internet department that just does the internet? But of course it eventually ended up affecting everything about what they did. And I think social media will follow a similar trajectory, that we'll have to, in the same way that we had to build internet connectivity into all of our software, we're going to have social features built into all of our software as well. And I think that will make it much better, but it will take quite a while. So my main takeaway is don't think this is a fad. This is a reassertion of the way things were for a very long time. And if anything was a fad, in fact, it was this incredibly centralized, industrialized version of the media that we've had for the last 100 years or so.
Yeah. Great. Mette asks here, having read the book, if history retweets itself, what would a smart move as a journalist on a weekly women's magazine be in the attempt to prepare myself for a media future?
Well, I think the main thing is to sign up for and use as many platforms as possible. Not because you expect those platforms to necessarily be the ones you have to use in your job in the future, but because the more familiar you are with more of them, the more quickly you can pick up new ones. So this is a sort of comparative religion approach to technology, and I think it applies in a lot of areas. I mean, it also enough in the field of computer programming. I think the best way to teach that is just to have people do a little bit of lots of languages so that they see the common patterns between them. But if you've used 2 or 3 blogging platforms, then when you're shown a fourth, you can pick it up very fast. And if you've used 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 social networks, when you see another one, you can pick it up very fast, and you can start to work out what the the different sort of customs and rules are on those platforms. So that's my main advice, I think, to stay ahead of this. Just sign up for as much as possible and try using it, and just sort of get over the idea of being scared of signing up for or having to adapt to a new system. And this is the great things, I think, about growing up with video games. Every single video game works in a different way. It has a different system of menus. It has a different hierarchy. It has different rules. And when kids played video games, when you've played 5 or 10 video games, you just get used to the idea that when you start using a new video game, you have to figure that out, and it becomes very easy. And I think this is becoming more mainstream with apps now. I mean, apps kind of all work the same way, but they all kind of have their different little quirks as well. And so I think people are getting less scared. They don't expect to get an instruction book with software anymore, which is that's fantastic. That's massive progress, I think. So I think the same is true of these social platforms. Just sign up for as many as you can, familiarize with yourself with as many as you can, and that way you will be much more flexible and agile when it comes to adapting to whatever is actually being used in the workplace.
Great. Tom, your book, which I and we recommend everyone to read because it's such a great perspective on things. After putting the book out there, and you must have interacted with hundreds and hundreds of people after launching the book, have you discovered, come across, have people told you other new interesting historical perspectives after putting the book out there?
Yes, I mean, in particular, there is a big gap in the book's coverage, which is it doesn't look at Asia at all. And this was because I found a few examples. There's some particularly interesting examples of social poetry in Japan in the 10th and 11th centuries. And it's sort of similar to what happens in the Tudor period, where writing poetry is used as a way to demonstrate your intellectual agility and your prowess and to win favor at court and so on. I found a few examples, and I found some in China as well, but I was very aware of the fact that I was not able to see into the sources at all there because I don't read either of those languages. So rather than do it badly, I decided to limit the book to considering the history of media in the Western world. But in the course of talking to people about the book, I have been collecting examples of historical examples from Asia. So perhaps in future I'll be able to add a chapter on that. The other area, if I had unlimited amounts of time to do this, where I'd like to expand, is I would like to add a chapter on social media that's sort of electronic but pre-internet. So in particular, that's the use of photocopiers to distribute information in the Soviet Union, the use of cassette tapes of Islamist sermons in the run-up to the Iranian Revolution. So it turned out that the sermons distributed on cassette were an extremely effective way of getting people behind the revolution in Iran. And there's a third example, which is fanzines. So fanzines are a sort of social media because they had this custom that when people wrote to the letters page of fanzines, their home address would be printed, so people could then respond to them. And so they created this sort of social networking platform. That's not electronic, that one, but I like all of these examples of how social media was sort of still around in the mass media era, and was sort of getting ready to come back. And so the internet was really pushing on an open door in that respect, because people were already starting to use the ability to copy things more easily with photocopiers and tape-to-tape machines than they'd been able to in the past.
Interesting. I quite often come across students at a different level, at bachelor students who sort of look at sort of consume media like BuzzFeed and Upworthy, but look very critically at them and sort of feel that they are degrading journalism. And I've tried a number of times to get them to read your book, or try to say that what Luther did was basically writing a BuzzFeed list of 95 ways in which the Pope and his gang were crazy. But do you see it as a sort of a degradation of journalism and the seriousness using these tools of social media distribution?
Well, I think it's very clear that a repeating pattern in the history of media is that whenever it gets easier to publish stuff, the people who were previously publishing stuff will always look down their noses at it. And we've seen this again and again and again. We see it with Erasmus, for example, in the 1520s. There's the trouble with all these pamphlets flying around is that nobody's reading the classics anymore. So nobody's reading Cicero because they're reading pamphlets by Luther. And then, novels are thought to be leading people astray in the 18th century. So there's always this debate about trivialization. And I don't buy it. I mean, so the fact that BuzzFeed and Upworthy exists doesn't mean that there isn't more serious stuff being published as well, and I don't have a problem with it. And I think it's very interesting the way BuzzFeed is injecting much more serious content. It's essentially a bait and switch, if you like, or it's sugaring the pill. It's getting you to read more serious stuff by mixing it in with this other stuff. And Upworthy is interesting just because it has an explicit agenda, and I think that's quite interesting as a strategy that they're trying to sort of spread the sort of thing they think more people ought to read, and they are doing such an amazingly good job of doing it that they seem to have sort of figured out what the formula is to get things to spread. So I don't have a problem with either of those two things because I don't think they're being dishonest about what they're doing. They are what they are, and not everyone will like them.
Yeah. Do you think that media people and journalists positioned in other kinds of media should hurry up and learn from them?
Yes, I think we could learn a great deal from them. I think because they are digital native startups, they are prepared to do things that traditional news organizations are not, and that gives them an advantage because they're prepared to try new advertising models and things like that. And we sort of, those of us who are used to the usual way these things were done, say, oh no, that would be going too far. But what we mean by that is it would be sort of in some way violating a tradition that we have, and they don't have that tradition, and so you see all sorts of interesting new business models coming out of these clean sheet digital startups that I think traditional media organizations would never go near, and that's I think we do need to be open to some of these new models, but we need to find ways to do them that we are happy with. So we've been doing this at The Economist. We have our own approach to what's called native advertising, and it's different from the way others do it, but it's a way that we feel happy with, where you clearly separate the sponsor's content from the editorial content, and you clearly label things, and you're not trying to fool people into thinking that an article from a sponsor is in fact an article from The Economist. So we found a way to do it that we think works, and the New York Times is working on this as well. So I think it is possible for the old guys to learn some tricks from the young guys, and I think those that sort of say no, this is just bad and we shouldn't do it at all, I think they'll suffer if they do that.
There's actually a question here on the list touching a bit off on that. The fashion bloggers in Denmark readily admit that they have no interest in being critical, and they just sort of want to show clothes that they like, and they, by the way, also receive a lot of free stuff from the industry. Where is the place still for sort of critical fashion journalism in such?
Is there any critical fashion journalism? I don't think this is a criticism of. I mean, basically, we're saying because the fashion bloggers are not critical, the problem is the blogging. It's the platform that's making them not critical. That's not what the problem is here. Fashion journalists never want to bite the hand that feed, do they? I mean, it's not a field that is renowned for vicious criticism of the people it writes about. So I think I think this is that we've seen this over and over again in the last 10 years. This rather tedious debate about bloggers and whether they're real journalists or not, or something. Lots of journalists are also bloggers. Lots of bloggers commit journalism without being, paid as journalists. But for some reason, we kind of assume that there's something inherent in the use of blogging platforms that changes the content. I mean, I really don't understand this. So people say, well, you can't trust bloggers, but you can trust the mainstream media. And this is obviously rubbish. There are obviously lots of mainstream media sources that you can't trust at all. And there are obviously lots of bloggers that you can. So this is clearly independent of the platform that is being used. And I think trying to sort of make generalizations about content on the basis of the platform that is being used to deliver it is just silly. And instead what we should be doing is looking at at who is doing this, how transparent are they being about their objectives, and their, who's paying them, and if they're not being transparent, then why not? So I think that's really the way to look at it, rather than getting bogged down in bloggers versus normal journalists or something.
Yeah. Great. One of the team has spotted that you were quoted from a conference in Qatar saying that big things are going. Let's see, what was the question? We can expect technology to transform the world of journalism in the Middle East. Can you maybe elaborate a bit?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. So I did do this speech in Qatar, and it was mainly because I've long at The Economist, when I covered telecoms, I wrote about the how great it is when you deregulate telecoms markets. And Qatar had just deregulated its telecoms markets, and the government was very pleased with themselves for doing this because they were being, progressive, more open market, taking a non-monopolistic approach to this. But the press weren't writing about it and weren't saying how brilliant they were. So they wanted me to go and talk to people there. And one of the things I did was do this speech about technology journalism more broadly. It was a long time ago, though. I think it was like 5 years ago. And so I would love to be able to say that I was predicting the Arab Spring, but I wasn't. All I was saying was that in the same way that technology has transformed journalism everywhere else in the world, it was very likely that it was going to transform and upend journalism in the Middle East. So I'm afraid I wasn't saying anything more radical or provocative than that. Sorry.
All right, great. Tom, we're sort of winding up here. Everyone's sort of very curious as to how do you sort of juggle being an editor, which I'm sure is a pretty demanding job, and also writing international bestsellers?
The answer is that the gap between my books has increased. So when I started writing books, and I was quite a junior correspondent at The Economist, I had a lot more time to spend on writing books. So at the time, I would write a book every other year, and then the gap went from 2 years to 3 years, and now it's gone up to 4 years. And so on the current agenda, I would be expected to produce another book in 2017, and I would start writing it at the end of this year. But I don't even know if I'm going to have time to do that, because I'm doing more and more new digital ventures at The Economist, and they're taking up more of my time. The other thing is I haven't got a subject yet that I really want to write another book about. But I always say this at this point, which is sort of, in the year after a book coming out, I always say, that's it, I'm not going to write any more books. And my wife always laughs and says, oh, yes, you will. And so at the moment, I'm not working on anything, and I'm not planning to. But I'll probably have the itch again by the end of the year, and then I will have to just find the way to carve out the time. But it has become more and more difficult, and that's why the gap between my books has got bigger and bigger.
Tom, huge thanks from us here for participating in this. It was just simply brilliant, and thanks also for the great questions from the team here. So let's give Tom a hand, please. Thank you. Tell people where they best can connect with you.
Well, fortunately, I have a surname which is quite unusual. So if you Google me, you can find my website, you can find my books, and you can find me on Twitter and other platforms quite easily, because I usually get there first and take the name Tom Standage. So that makes life much simpler. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for your questions.
Brilliant, huh? Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.